Had Jester been religious, the opening of the sky followed by the deluge of rain might have felt like a baptism, a sign that would wash away the ominous feeling he had about the mission. But he wasn't religious, so instead, it was more like a drowning. The rain began to fall in heavy droplets, slicing through the darkness like icy needles. Ares, clad in black, sat silently, the roar of the ocean masking whatever words they tried to share. A nameless operative was at the wheel of the combatant craft medium assault boat, the vehicle cutting through the sea like a knife. The derelict oil tanker, MV Sea Titan, loomed ahead, a rusting behemoth anchored in the restless sea. The Colossus was a patchwork of corroded metal and peeling paint, unmanned and unmoving. Barnacles encrusted its waterline, and the hulking remains of its superstructure rose against the stormy sky. The ship's silhouette, stark and foreboding, was intermittently illuminated by flashes of lightning, casting jagged shadows across its decks. The small CCM boat, powered by a nearly silent motor, approached the tanker's starboard side. Ares moved with practiced precision, each knowing their role, without the need for verbal command. The CCM bumped softly against the tanker, the sound swallowed by the wind and rain. Without a word, Sentinel motioned for them to turn on their headlamps and follow. The engine of the smaller boat was cut, and with a muted pop, a grappling hook was launched skyward. It arced across the tanker's deck, catching on the railing, and held. A backup in case their first line of ascent failed. One by one, they grabbed a hold of the rusted ladder hanging precariously over the side of the tanker. The metal was slick with rain and algae, cold and unyielding under their gloved hands. The climb was treacherous, the ladder swaying and banging against the metal hull. Above the deck of the tanker was a desolate expanse, littered with debris and forgotten equipment. Pools of rainwater reflected the intermittent flashes of lightning, an eerie, fragmented mirror of the storm-tossed sky. They pulled themselves onto the deck of the Sea Titan, and once all six were on board, they waited for the seventh. He took a quick glance at the rest of his team. Despite being pissed about the gear change, Jester had to admit the effect was chilling. Before, he needed no time to identify who was who, even with all of their faces covered. But now he had to rely on height and body shape, which the darkness made even harder. Otherwise, they were all identical shadows, even down to the guns in their hands. Sentinel and Raptor were nearly indistinguishable from one another, each of them carrying an FN Scar-L. Both he and Hawkeye carried the heavy variant. Hawkeye's was the precision version, while his came with a grenade launcher attachment. Lastly, Aegis and Tempest were equipped with the FN Scar-SC, the subcompact variant. All of them carried the same sidearm, the FN-57 Mark III. Their newest recruit, XO-001, came well-equipped all on his own. Jester didn't like the robot. It wasn't that he had any issues with robots or Umbral's sometimes terrifying advanced technology per se. It was more that he couldn't understand why they had to have it with them, and why it had to be human-shaped. Wouldn't a drone or something with 4 legs be better suited to the messes that Ares so commonly found themselves embroiled in? As he watched the robot scale the ladder in surprisingly smooth, uncanny motions, he supposed 2 arms and 2 legs did make sense, but he still didn't like it. XO-001, or the Electronic Xenomorphic Operative, varied in popularity amongst the team. They had trained with it for a few weeks now. By all accounts, it was a phenomenal machine. It stood a little taller than Jester himself, and was new enough that its components were still a glossy raven black. Its head was covered by a helmet that looked eerily similar to the ones that Ares themselves wore, with its designation stamped in white on the forehead. Inside the helmet was a complex array of sensors, cameras, and a visor containing an advanced AI interface. Exo could show them images and videos on the visor, making it convenient for when the entire team needed to see a map or visual all at the same time. Exo was lightweight and nimble, could withstand extreme conditions, and could quickly cycle between close and long-range combat scenarios in an instant. A small automatic rifle was built into his left arm, while a larger, long-range gun was built into its back, where it could be quickly accessed. It was sleek and deadly, but that wasn't its main purpose. It was supposed to be their new electronic warfare specialist. The robot was capable of lightning-fast counterintelligence measures and could interface with and disrupt hostile systems. Like the human man that came before it, Exo could cripple enemy infrastructure and give Ares an advantage unlike any other. While Exo had displayed all of these capabilities in training, Jester was reluctantly curious to see how it could really perform in the field. He had a feeling that Umbral trained the thing on complicated but clean scenarios, and fieldwork was anything but clean. But the time for speculation was over. They had Exo with them for the job, for better or for worse. Ares moved like phantoms, their movements silent and synchronized. Boots whispered against the metal deck, their breaths barely audible over the relentless drumming of the rain. A quiet voice, the driver of the small boat below, came over their comms.
"It's getting rough out here. I'm returning to the launch point."
"Affirmative," Sentinel said, and they all watched as the lights of the craft sped into the darkness, bumping over the waves. Ares would be busy for quite some time. There was no reason for extraction to wait. This job should be simple enough, but Jester had fallen into that trap of a mindset enough to avoid it this time around. Nothing was ever that simple with these jobs. He was prepared for the worst, and if he was lucky, there would be some fun things to blow up along the way. Well, maybe huge explosions weren't the best idea on a ship that had clearly seen better days. He'd keep it small. The Sea Titan had definitely seen better days, though. Its facade hadn't been made to last, and it was cracking away from the main structure like an exoskeleton. Before it had been masquerading as the oil tanker Sea Titan, the enormous ship had been the research vessel Breakthrough. Breakthrough had been the mobile base for Blackwell Genetics, a radical, unscrupulous genetic sciences corporation that managed to avoid restrictive laws by staying on the water and moving when needed. 11 years ago, Umbral, being rather unscrupulous as well, had contracted Blackwell to do some dirty work for them, things that might even turn Umbral scientists' stomachs. From the debriefing Ares had received, Jester knew that Blackwell had been a perfect hire for Umbral for a little over a year before the Breakthrough had gone radio silent. Further investigation, both by the military and Umbral themselves, turned up nothing but a small debris field where the Breakthrough had been pinged. It had been a minor catastrophe for Umbral, and embarrassing enough that they had quickly scrubbed any evidence of their temporary allegiance with Blackwell from their records. Skip to earlier this month, a gargantuan, unmanned oil tanker had been reported floating 30 miles off the coast of Africa. It was emblazoned with the name MV Titan, but something about the ship had piqued the interest of Umbral intelligence officers. After a lengthy investigation, it was determined that there was a good chance that Sea Titan was actually Breakthrough, disguised and now abandoned. No one knew exactly why Blackwell would have gone through the trouble of disguising the ship and disappearing in obscurity. The leading theory was that they had managed to create something phenomenal with the information that Umbral had given them to work with. Whatever it was must have been significant enough for them to intentionally disappear, assumedly to return once their experiments bore fruit. But something had happened in that decade to leave the ship floating, abandoned in international waters. It was all the better for Umbral, though, who wanted to recover the vessel as quickly as possible. The possibility for danger was apparently large enough that they couldn't just send in the salvage crews, which of course is where Ares came in. As usual, Umbral gave Ares just enough information to keep them alive. If they had truly believed that the ship was empty, they would have never bothered sending the team out. It was just wasting more time that some other megacorporation could use to scoop the vessel out from under them. So the fact that they had sent Ares meant that there was the potential for something terrible to be lurking in the ship's shadows. And at this time of night, everything was a shadow. The team's objective was to clear the ship of any hostiles, with the secondary objective of recovering anything time-sensitive that couldn't wait for salvage crew. Each of them had the blueprints for Breakthrough on their interfaces, but even with just the light of their headlamps, Jester had the feeling that they weren't going to be accurate. They all formed a loose circle around the commander, who gave them quick instructions. "We'll start at the stern and make our way back. Our information indicates that there are 3 floors, but we need to be thorough in case things have changed. If we find any Blackwell employees alive, we keep them that way at all costs. Umbral wants answers about what happened and why they stole the research." The sound of their collective agreement was lost in a clap of thunder, but the sentiment was understood. The storm lashed the upper deck as they advanced, with lightning crackling across the sky, momentarily illuminating the twisted landscape of the false tanker. The vessel groaned and creaked under the onslaught of the waves, rocking back and forth, swaying under their feet. The ship's superstructure loomed ahead, a skeletal frame jutting against the sky, cables and pipes dangling like sinews from a carcass. A smell of rust and salt permeated the air, mingling with the faint, acrid odor of old fuel. Raptor motioned for 2 of them to spread out and search the aft section. He pointed to the remnants of a lifeboat davit, its corroded arms hanging limply over the side. Hawkeye and Aegis moved to inspect it, their movements quick and efficient, weapons scanning the shadows. The rest stood guard, and the rage of the storm began to ebb, at least for the moment. When Hawkeye and Aegis returned, having found nothing, the medic pushed her visor up long enough to massage the bridge of her nose. "Nothing to report, except I keep getting wafts of something pungent where the deck was damaged. I think we should switch to night vision, to save our eyes. It's so damn dark," she reported. Hawkeye grunted his agreement. Exo's dark head was panning over the deck, a faint green light blinking somewhere in the depths of it. "It would be beneficial to restore power if possible." "That's all you, buddy." Jester reached over to give the machine a reassuring pat on the shoulder. The sleek head swiveled in his direction and held. It was only a little unnerving. "Stop jostling the robot," Raptor snapped. "If you break it, then I'm volunteering you for the next brain chip." "What brain?" Tempest added, and Jester grinned. Hawkeye was, as to be expected, silent, but if he wasn't mistaken, the sniper had gone even more rigid than usual at the discussion. They didn't get along outside of work. Hell, Jester wasn't even sure Hawkeye existed outside of work, but he'd have to be made of stone to not have empathy for him. During preparation for the mission, he had gotten the first look at Hawkeye since his brain-to-computer interface chip had been removed. His head was shaved, and the incision was still red and angry right next to the now white line from the first surgery. The sniper had done a passable job as their Sci-Fi stand-in over the past months, but everyone could see that it had changed him. The thing in his head had caused him pain, from what Jester understood, and thunderclap migraines were pretty much the worst-case scenario for any sniper, let alone one of the best in the world. Umbrel apparently wanted to retain Hawkeye's sniper skills, and announced the trial run for the brain interface chip was over. So Hawkeye was just Hawkeye again, quiet, hulking, and no longer responsible for fumbling with technology that would have been handled in the blink of an eye with Sci-Fi. Man, I miss that kid, he thought. They switched over to night vision, but the split second between the headlamp going off and the night vision coming on was harrowing. For a heartbeat, the world was black, salt-scented, and rolled under his feet. Jester braced himself and let out a sigh of relief when his vision was washed in a field of green. The bridge was ahead, dark and foreboding, its windows shattered, rain pouring inside. They edged closer, Sentinel signaling for silence with a raised fist. At first, he wasn't sure why they stopped, but then he heard it. From below, a series of sounds rose, previously covered up by the din of the storm. It couldn't be written off as the ship's body creaking and settling either. Instead, they all stood unmoving and listened to the scraping, tapping, an occasional guttural moan emanating from below their feet. It sounded like hell itself. Already unsettled, Jester couldn't suppress his slight jump when a sudden flash of lightning revealed a figure standing at the far end of the deck, near the bow. It was human-sized, but slightly shorter, bent at the waist with a back that curved in a clumsy arch. The operatives froze, weapons trained on the silhouette. Another flash, and the figure was gone, leaving only an after-image burned into their retinas. "We all saw that, right?" Sentinel nodded, his jaw set. "Stay sharp. We don't know what we're dealing with." They continued their sweep, passing rusted hatches and abandoned equipment. A winch, its cables tangled and frayed, loomed like a metal beast, shadows dancing around it with each flicker of lightning. The deck was littered with debris, twisted metal, rotting ropes, and shattered glass crushed underfoot. Beneath their feet, the eerie sounds persisted, a constant threat that their current peace was soon to be shattered, and there was no way to avoid it. They were walking to the heart of danger willingly. Suddenly, a hatch burst open only 10 or so feet to their left. The sound, a sharp crack that ricocheted through the humid air. A rush of foul air escaped, carrying with it a sense of foreboding. Raptor motioned for Jester to follow him, leaving the rest of the team to cover. They approached cautiously, peering into the black maw of the hatch. The sounds from below were louder now, guttural and primitive, yells and groans of misery, almost human, but not quite. It made something deep in his gut clench. Only Jester wasn't sure if it was from pity or fear. But despite the sounds, the hatch was solidly dark. Whatever had forced the old cover open was gone. Exo glided to the hatch, its helmet-covered head cocking to the side. The robot reached down, its fingers closing around the edge of the hatch. The thin limbs tightened, and the robot heaved. There was a shriek of metal as Exo wrenched the hatch free, flinging it to the side. The robot leaned forward to peer into the newly revealed chasm, and Jester resisted the urge to grab its shoulder and pull it away. Something slammed against Exo from within the darkness, sending it careening sideways, its balance thrown. Jester caught the robot, a surprised breath escaping him as he realized how heavy Exo actually was. He struggled to steady Exo, but the robot was already straightening, and Jester released it. He peered into the chasm, his own weapon ready, and could make out a flurry of movement into the gloom below. He aimed into the darkness, waiting for something to show itself. The team crowded around them, weapons trained downward, their breathing shallow. But whatever had attacked Exo retreated back into the recesses of the ship, and Jester shook his head. Wordless, Exo ventured a step into the hole, and Sentinel yanked it back. "Not yet," he hissed. "We don't know what we're dealing with." Jester snorted. "Have we ever?" Sentinel ignored him, and the team backed away from the hatch. "Let's finish this deck and get the hell out of this rain. Whatever we're supposed to dispatch is obviously on the lower level." The rest agreed, and Ares continued their sweep, but Jester couldn't help but glance back at the gaping hatch, the sounds from below seeming to grow louder, taunting them. He wondered how many hostiles were down there. What the hell had Blackwell been messing with? Once the deck was fully cleared, they circled back around the bulkhead door that, according to the old blueprints, would take them to the second level of the ship. At the front, Sentinel went to turn the wheel, but it didn't budge. Raptor stepped up next, his enhanced strength still coming up short when he strained against the door. Finally, the two leaders reluctantly stepped aside and let Exo give it a shot. The robot braced itself, the smooth head tilting downwards. Jester could swear the thing was smiling. It grabbed the wheel and twisted, and for a moment it seemed like the door was finally going to give. The wheel gave a few squealing centimeters up, but froze once more. Exo stepped back, informing them. "The door is rusted shut, and the wheel has seized." "Yeah, thanks for the update, buddy," Jester huffed. "Any ideas for opening it?" Exo tilted his head to the side, considering. The robot then motioned to Jester. "You are the demolition expert. I expect that your expertise will be needed in this case." "You hear that, guys? My expertise." Shouldering his rifle and strutting forward, Jester laughed. "Maybe you aren't so bad, Exo." "I am neither good nor bad. I am a neutral entity." Ever the curmudgeon lately, Raptor growled. "Jester, please shut up and do your job." Tempest chuckled, and Jester could practically see the smirk behind the mask. He shot a finger gun at her, and she returned it with both of hers. Aegis turned her helmeted head to the side, and he was sure she was grinning too. Sentinel just shook his head and motioned to the bulkhead. Jester squatted down and opened his pack to rummage through his supplies. Stealth was out the window, since whatever was lurking beneath the boards already knew they were there. He also couldn't blow the thing to hell and back and risk sinking the already sketchy ship. No, he needed to be precise. After digging through various charges and det cord, Jester settled on a charge small enough to break the lock without compromising the integrity of the hull. He hooked the device to the wheel, then gave Ares the signal to step back. They did so, and Jester attached a remote detonator to the charge. He clicked it. There was a deafening bang, followed by the screeching of metal against metal. Smoke billowed from the door as Jester waved it away. the others fanning out to scan for hostiles. Nothing emerged from the wreckage, but Jester couldn't help but imagine a horde of something awful rushing them, teeth gnashing and claws tearing. But there was nothing. Nothing but the eerie sounds from below, and the wind and rain. When it seemed the coast was relatively clear, Sentinel motioned for them forward and into the second level of the ship. They passed through a maze of hallways, dim shapes appearing in the green glow of their night vision. Broken syringes littered the floor, and torn lab coats hung from hooks, still swaying. The facade of the oil tanker was completely gone now. They were now clearly aboard the destroyed RV Breakthrough. The hallway terminated into a large room that might have once been the galley. A long table, rusted and rotten, sat in the center. On the wall was a row of cabinets, all smashed, their contents scattered across the floor. Here, the smell, like an overrun barnyard in the baking sun, was stronger. To the right was the engine room, and Sentinel directed Exo to go and try to restore the ship's power. Jester shifted to guard the entrance, Tempest and Aegis following suit. Hawkeye took point, his scope sweeping the far end of the room. Sentinel and Raptor crouched near the table, speaking in low tones. Exo indicated it would take some time, so they moved on and left the robot to work while they continued to clear the space. The rooms were empty, and Jester frowned. If the ship's crew had perished, where were the bodies? The noises had only intensified now, but they seemed to be contained to the back half of the second level. Something, maybe another seized door, was keeping them separated. Past the galley was the staging area for what appeared to be a laboratory, with more lab coats and broken equipment dotting the area. One wall was lined with shelves, their contents reduced to shards of glass and plastic. The countertops were pockmarked with punctures and claw marks, and blood splatters and drag marks decorated the floor. One wall was all lockers, gray and faded, some with doors hanging open. Aegis moved forward to inspect them, using the butt of her rifle to bust into one of those that were still closed. She was slow and methodical, and Jester watched as the remnants of lives lived were revealed. Backpacks and messenger bags, some covered with buttons and patches, a few dog-eared books, hoodies from various universities and companies, and pictures of family and loved ones taped to the inner doors. Somewhere deep inside the demolitions expert, there was a pang of regret for whatever violent end these people met, and maybe, just a little, for the type of life he himself would never have. These people would have probably been monsters if they'd been tasked with performing experiments that Umbral didn't want to mess with. But Jester had also learned that humans were great at compartmentalizing. Commit war crimes at work, and then go home. He glanced away, scanning the room instead of following that thought. Hawkeye had climbed to the top of one of the counters to gain higher ground, his rifle trained towards the entrance to the airlock that undoubtedly led to the lab. It was another bulkhead door, not as tragically rusted as the one exposed to the elements, but also looked seized, which meant he was up again. He would need even more of a careful hand with this inner door, and while it was quiet enough, there was no telling what was on the other side. Knowing that Ares was positioned behind him at the ready, Jester knelt and began setting the new charge. It was delicate work, but within minutes, Jester was pressing the detonator. This time, there was no bang, only a muffled pop as the locking mechanism broke. He had no time to give himself the usual mental pat on the back for being the most amazing explosive expert on Earth. because instead, the mutated ape on the other side of the door had seized him by the shoulders and threw him across the room. Ares was lightning fast, fingers pulling triggers before the ape even got its hands in Jester, the huge, swollen head flying back with the force of the bullets. But the body kept following the last electrical impulses of the brain and launched Jester into the air and across the room before it collapsed into a gory heap. After Raptor gave her a subtle jerk of his chin towards the crumpled man on the ground, she peeled away from the formation to check on Jester. He was already raising himself up onto one elbow, reaching for his dropped weapon. "Damn thing was in there the whole time," Jester coughed, his voice raw. "Looks like he wanted to make a dramatic entrance," Tempest said, as she extended a gloved hand to help him to his feet. "You good?" "Good enough." Jester shook himself, rolling his neck and stretching his shoulders. "That was an animal, right? An animal silently waiting and planning an ambush?" "I'm not sure. Let's go see." Jester nodded and raised his weapon as they approached the corpse where the rest of the team was waiting. Up close, the thing was truly monstrous, a hulking mass of muscle and flesh. It was bigger than a regular gorilla, at least a foot taller, and its massive arms ended in long, thick fingers. Its face was twisted and deformed, jaw unhinged and distended. The tongue lolled out of its mouth, nearly black. Aegis knelt to inspect the creature, poking at the ruined chest with the barrel of her rifle. "It's definitely a gorilla, or at least based on one. I can see why Umbral wouldn't want to work on something like this themselves." She stood, dusting off her gloved hands. "One breakout and an entire lab could be annihilated." "Could that be what happened here?" Sentinel asked, but Aegis could only offer a shrug. "Seems likely, but I would have thought they had some sort of contingency plan." "Not if they thought Umbral would find them eventually, and they were trying to rush through the research," Raptor offered. "Too many experiments, too fast, and just a single breakout could bring the whole thing tumbling down." It was an unsettling thought, especially when she considered how massive the gorilla creature was. The medic looked the ruined creature over once more, an idea already forming in the back of her mind. She didn't think Umbral would use something as unpredictable as these apes in the field. This led her to consider that they might be the prototype, and that the next step in the horror show would be to apply these mutations to human subjects. There was one more door in the airlock separating them from the next large room. This one was normal instead of thick metal, and was already loose on its track. Ares knew they were walking into the epicenter of it all, but that's what they were there for. Even after all these years, it still made Aegis' stomach roll to consider running towards danger instead of away. On the other side of the door, the sounds had become less chaotic and more intentional. It almost felt to Aegis like drumming or a heartbeat. The smell was nearly suffocating, the stench of too much life in too small of a space for much too long. Sentinel lifted one foot, brought his knee back, and kicked the door down in one swift motion. On the other side of the door was the lab, or at least what was left of it. There was a thick layer of grime on the ground, in the same pressing darkness as everywhere else. And scattered throughout the large room, the creatures waited, hooting and pounding their clenched fists on the floors, walls, and consoles around them. The gargantuan one they had dispatched in the doorway was an oddity among them. Inside of the lab, most of the apes were chimpanzee-like, smaller and more compact. There were less than a dozen of them, but the fury rolling through the crowd made up for the smaller than expected numbers. They didn't rush forward like she expected, but instead waited for Ares to make the first move, thin lips peeling back from teeth to expose terrifyingly long canines. Her eyes swept over them, quickly, taking in the scene and their adversaries, and suppressed a shiver of unease. These weren't just oversized chimps. Some of them were whole, but unwell, too thin, or with patchy coats of hair. The others, though, were nightmares. The defects ranged from twisted hands and feet to large festering wounds, and in some extreme cases, horrifically damaged or even missing limbs. The most damaged of them displayed a frantic, almost feral desire to attack them, jerking forward before pulling themselves back, only small remnants of intelligence keeping them together. Umbral had specified to bring in any scientists alive, and would no doubt love to have a living test subject. But Aegis knew at first sight that it wasn't going to be possible. Any second, the lab was going to explode in violence, and they would be forced to put the animals down. She was glad of it. It would be a mercy for these sad, dangerous beasts. As if the lead ape, another gorilla among the smaller chimps, could sense that Ares was waiting for the order to attack, it bellowed and threw itself forward. Aegis crouched, bracing herself against the floor as Sentinel called out, "Fire! Fire!" Bullets whizzed overhead as Aegis pulled the trigger of her own weapon, aiming for the leader. It fell mid-lunge, slamming into the floor with a wet thud. She had moved her rifle to her next target, which was a mistake, because the gorilla was already back on its feet, even with a chest full of lead. Her aim was true, this time hitting the beast between the eyes as it charged her, but it was still able to knock her backwards. It landed heavily atop Aegis, forcing the breath from her lungs. She gasped, choking for air as the gorilla thrashed above her, snapping its jaws inches from her helmet in death spasms. Aegis shoved her rifle up beneath its chin and fired twice. The head exploded, showering her with gore. Aegis scrambled to her feet, wiping at her visor with the sleeve of her tactical vest, only to be knocked down again by another attacker. The chimp was missing one eye, and half of its face was ravaged, exposing teeth and bone. But she was in the flow now, and she managed to roll to the side. Swinging her rifle around and firing directly into the monster's back, severing the brainstem. Then she was in a crouch once more, resuming her position as if nothing had happened. Ares was down 4 chimps, the remaining 5 charging them with the reckless abandon. It was an ugly fight, but in truth barely a fight at all. The apes took an obscene amount of hits to fall, running on instinct and adrenaline, seemingly immune to pain. She knew from the hit she had taken and the way the first one had tossed Jester so effortlessly that they were unnaturally strong. But what chance did animals have against a team like Ares? They would have finished it in minutes if Exo hadn't come over their comms, telling them at the same time the lights above flickered on.
I managed to restore power in the backup generator. It should give us 90 minutes of power.
The light changed the creatures. At first they froze, shocked, having lived God knows how long in the complete darkness of the inside of the ship, only small bits of sunlight penetrating in broken places. But soon they were shrieking, throwing themselves against the walls and Ares in a renewed frenzy. In the harsh, bright light, they were even more terrifying. Skin hung in patches, bones protruded and mouths gaped open, tongues lolled from the sides of their faces, and they had lost any sense of control. Their advance now one of uncontrolled fury. At the back of the lab, the exit door was hit by a body on the other side of it, once, twice, and then it flew off the hinges as more of the apes pushed themselves inward. "Kill the power, Exo!" Sentinel roared, and just as quickly as the power had been restored, it flickered out. The hope was that the apes would return to the more controlled kind of advance once the darkness returned, but it was the opposite. Either the crazed frenzy from the light wasn't fading, or they were further enraged by the light being taken away after finally seeing the world in full color. The apes came at Ares harder than before, swarming them in the darkness. Aegis stumbled back, slamming into Tempest as one of the chimps launched itself at them. Tempest managed to grab the thing by the throat, holding it away from her in an impressive show of strength, while she buried her blade under its chin and into its brain. But the creature still struggled, snapping its jaws at Tempest's arm until Aegis put 3 bullets into its skull. The corpse fell to the ground, and Tempest spun away, resuming her place in Ares' defense line. Raptor and Sentinel tried to advance to hopefully cut the doorway off before even more hostiles entered. Hawkeye hung back, shooting ultra-precise kill shots between the ape's eyes, when possible, as cover. Exo and Jester joined him, the robot having returned only seconds before. "We need to get out of here," Jester shouted, as another group of chimps broke through the door led by another hulking gorilla. Their need to get to Ares was so powerful that they were tearing through each other, hurling their injured ape comrades through the air, or in some cases, ripping limbs off and using them as weapons. Between one heartbeat and the next, Sentinel made his decision. "Exo, cover us. Ares, move to the upper deck." Exo advanced past Sentinel and Raptor, flinging one of the apes through the air to crash into 2 of its friends. It caught one of the gorillas by the wrist and twisted, and Aegis winced at the sound of snapping bones before pushing it back and taking aim. The small machine gun built into its forearm swung out and clicked into place, and Exo opened fire. Aegis watched as Exo held the horde off long enough for the rest of them to make it through the airlock. "Duck!" Jester called, as Exo made it into the airlock once the rest of Ares was out, and when the robot obeyed, he launched a grenade past Exo and into the lab. The explosion was muffled, but the spray of blood and viscera that painted the inside of the room confirmed Jester's hit. They slammed the mostly intact bulkhead doors shut, sealing off the lab and giving them a moment to breathe. "Keep moving up," Raptor told them. "We'll have more room on the top." Jester panted. "I have an idea. Exo, listen up." He instructed Exo to rip 2 locker doors off, and with an impressive show of force, the robot followed Jester's orders and shoved them as hard as it could into the previously breached gaps in the bulkhead door. Then, with a crack of brilliant white, Jester activated his thermal breaching torch and made a messy weld, effectively sealing the door shut. Not too soon either, if the crazed sound of the apes on the other side of the airlock was any indication. "Move," Sentinel commanded, and this time they did, flowing like water through and up onto the deck and out into the open air. "That won't hold long, but we've got them in a bottleneck now. The plan is to pick them off one by one." Raptor was interrupted by the sound of bodies throwing themselves against the aforementioned door, and before he could continue, the telltale sound of it crashing open echoed. It was supposed to have bought them time to regroup. Instead, it had taken the apes mere minutes to break through. There was no reason to talk. They braced themselves and prepared to do as Raptor said, picking them off as they came above deck. It might have worked, had the apes not been willing to tear each other to pieces in order to reach Ares. They just couldn't wrap her mind around why they were so desperate to get to them instead of retreating to safety. But Then a horrible thought occurred to her, just as the creatures began to crawl over each other and out onto the deck. The frenzy of their chase. The missing crew. "They're hunting us," she gasped, raising her rifle. "For food." The implications of that were too much to consider, especially when the apes were swarming Ares, throwing themselves at them in waves. They all began firing in tandem. Ares was still in control of the situation, taking full advantage of the moments when the apes wedged themselves too tightly into the doorway and the flow slowed to a trickle. It was during one of these lulls when a splash, followed by a strange, scrabbling sound, came from behind them, just feet away at the bow. Aegis spared a glance backward, just in time to see a filthy hand clutch the rusted railing and pull itself over, followed immediately by a second set of hands. Shock rippled through the team at what they were seeing. The creatures had busted out a porthole and were scaling the side of the breakthrough, using rotting ropes and sheer will to get to the team. The plug of them blocking the door came free at the same moment, spilling a number of apes onto the deck, trapping Ares between two ever-growing groups. Aegis had a rare moment of hopeless fear at what she was seeing. They were trapped, with barely any space to move between the two groups. But it was gone as soon as it came, her training washing the emotion away like the tide. Sentinel barked an order, and Ares fell into a wedge formation. Their commander gestured for them to advance on the forward group of the creatures. The chimps rushed towards Ares, shrieking wildly as they ran. Ares advanced, raptor at the point of the wedge. He fired shots with his rifle, hitting one chimp square between the eyes. It tumbled forward, tripping two more, and the team closed the gap. It was messy, and she felt hands grabbing at her more than once. But Aegis kept her eyes forward. Step by single step, they would gain ground, only to be pushed back once more. Maybe it was the darkness, the last remnants of the storm, the chaos of the apes around them, or the fact that there had only been 6 of them for so long. All she knew was that it took too long for one of them to notice that there were, in fact, only 6 in the wedge. "Sentinel isn't with us," Hawkeye grunted, lowering his shoulder and driving it into an ape in front of him. His words barely had time to register before a bright light exploded to life behind them at the bow, and everything changed. Sentinel, one boot braced on the bow railing, and his climbing rope clipped onto it, had cracked a chemical light stick. It lit up the night like a miniature sun. Just like before, the apes froze, and then charged, howling and screaming. The animals pushed past Ares, over each other, barreling towards the light source with a single-minded intensity. She knew they all spotted what was in Sentinel's other hand at the same time, because a booming "Don't!" burst out of Raptor's mouth just as Aegis saw the grenade. Sentinel's light stick had pulled all the advancing apes towards him and away from the team, who was, all of a sudden, standing free from any hostiles. They raised rifles, carefully aiming away from the commander, but Sentinel was already pulling the pin. No, she thought. Sentinel's face was hidden by the helmet, but she knew exactly what the resolute expression on his face must look like. The commander tossed the grenade into the now enormous group of apes in front of him, throwing himself over the railing as soon as it left his hand, the rope following him down. The grenade exploded with a deafening boom, the deck shaking under their feet. The animals, closest to Sentinel, were ripped apart instantly, limbs and entrails painting the deck into great red streaks. Those slightly further back suffered the same fate, but those even further back were able to throw themselves overboard in order to avoid being blown into bits. The remainder was dispatched by Ares as the team ran towards the location where their commander had disappeared. A gust of wind blew over them, clearing the grenade smoke, and the team was silent. It revealed the empty space where Sentinel, the railing on which he had stood, and the rope that he had clipped it with, had all been blown away. He was gone.